Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. Hey everyone, before today's episode gets started, I just want to talk a little bit about the fight against Alzheimer's. For those of you that don't know, my family has been impacted by Alzheimer's, and my wife and I are members of the Young Champions for the Minnesota North Dakota chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. The world may look a little different right now, but one thing hasn't changed: the Alzheimer's Association's commitment to ending Alzheimer's. This year, Walk to End Alzheimer's is everywhere on every sidewalk, track, and trail. Due to COVID, this year won't be a large in-person gathering. Instead, everyone will be walking in small teams of friends and family. We are all still walking and fundraising for the same thing: a world without Alzheimer's and all other dementia. So I'm asking that if you can, please support our team for the Alzheimer's Association's Walk to End Alzheimer's. This walk is the world's largest event to raise awareness and funds for Alzheimer's care, support, and research. Thank you in advance, and you can find information and links below. And now, back to the show. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So, on today's episode, I've got a deck tech for you that you might see as exciting. You might think it's extreme, but you're not going to call it expensive. That's right, today's deck tech is on Zaxara, the Exemplary. So the ground rules for my deck techs are as follows. The budget is $50 or less, and that's an overall deck cost. So that cost includes shipping, as well as commanders, as long as they're $10 or less, but basic lands will not be included in that price. On my deck techs, I'm going to take you through the strategy, the tactics, and how the deck wins. Today's episode comes to you courtesy of Jameson Brown, a general tier patron. I truly couldn't do this without the support from amazing patrons like Jameson. And for the personalized deck tech, Jameson chose Zaxara, the Exemplary. Jameson's always been a green player and loves overwhelming opponents with creatures, so that's exactly what we're going to do. Zaxara is a 2/3 Nightmare Hydra with Death Touch that costs 1 black, green, blue. It has tap, add 2 mana of any one color, and whenever you cast a spell with X in its mana cost, create a 0/0 green Hydra creature token, then put X+1/1 counters on it. So Zaxara is a great source of ramp and also a token creator for us. Essentially every single one of our X spells comes with a Hydra attached. So our strategy for this deck is very straightforward. We're going to cast X spell after X spell to make a ton of Hydras. Not only do we get the value from our spell, but we also get a huge threat in the board as well. And how are we going to win with this deck? Well, we're going to smash some face with some Hydras. After we fill the board, we've got plenty of ways to get them through and to make them even bigger. And as always, I'm going to take you through 10 different tactics to show you how this deck works and how we're going to win with it. So let's start things off with tactic number 1, experience. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice to get a basic land and play tapped. Next up, we've got Font of Fertility, which essentially does the exact same thing, but it's an enchantment and we pay 1 and a green to do so. And then Search for Tomorrow is another great turn 1 play. It has to spend 2 for a green and gets us 1 basic and play untapped. Next up, we've got a fantastic turn 2 play with Sakura Tri-Belter, which we can sacrifice to get a basic and play tapped. Some other great turn 2 plays come with Rampant Growth, Edge of Autumn, and Farseek. Rampant Growth is going to get us 1 basic and play tapped, and Edge of Autumn does the exact same thing if we've got 4 or fewer lands. And on top of that, we can cycle it by sacrificing a land. Next up, there's Farseek, which can get us either an island or a swamp into play tapped. And then we've got 2 ways to get extra lands into play with Explore and Growth Spiral. Explore lets us play 1 additional land this turn and we draw a card, and Growth Spiral lets us draw a card and then put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield at instant speed. Next up, there's Cultivate, which gets us 2 basic lands, 1 goes into our hand and 1 goes onto the battlefield tapped. And then Grow from the Ashes gets us 1 basic into play untapped, or 2 if we kicked it. Finally, there's Migration Path, which gets us 2 basics into play tapped, or we can cycle it for 2. But we're not quite done with lands or ramping just yet. Next up, let's move on to tactic number 2, Extraordinary. First up, there's Frontier Siege, which when it comes into play, we choose Khans or Dragons, but for this deck, we're going to be choosing Khans. So at the beginning of each of our main phases, we add green to our mana pool. This is actually going to be a ton of mana throughout the game, essentially adding 4 mana each turn. It can easily add 2 mana to 2 X spells during our turn, and this can come in huge. Speaking of X spells, we're also running Animus Awakening, which says reveal the top X cards of your library, put all land cards among them onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. On top of that, if we've got Spell Mastery, we untap those lands. So this is an X spell that can ramp us by a ton, and we can also cast another X spell if we've got that Spell Mastery. Next up, we've got the legendary sorcery, Kamal's Druidic Vow. It says, look at the top X cards of your library. You may put any number of land and or legendary permanents with converted mana costs X or less among them onto the battlefield, put the rest into your graveyard. So this can get us a ton of lands off the top of our library into play untapped. And then we're running Mana Bloom, which is going to enter the battlefield with X charge counters on it. We can remove a charge counter from it to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool, and we activate this ability only once each turn. On top of that, it says at the beginning of your upkeep, if Mana Bloom has no charge counters on it, return to its owner's hand. So this is kind of a way to store mana, and it's a repeatable X spell since it can keep going back to our hand when it runs out of charge counters. And finally, we're running Nylea's Intervention, which says choose 1. Search your library for up to X land cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand, then shuffle your library, or Nylea's Intervention deals twice X damage to each creature with flying. So this can ensure that we're hitting our land drops, or can take out pretty much every creature with flying. But we've got other ways to take out our opponent's things in tactic number 3, exit. First up, they're Stolen by the Fae, which says return target creature with converted mana cost X to its owner's hand. You create X/1/1 blue fairy creature tokens with flying. So we bounce something, we get a ton of fairies, and on top of that, we get a Hydra. Yeah, that's a great deal. And then there's Repeal, which says return target non-land permanent with converted mana cost X to its owner's hand, draw a card. An even bigger way to bounce things, though, comes with Distorting Wake, which says return X target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. This deck can generate a ton of mana, so we're going to be bouncing a lot of things. And then we're running a pretty mean X spell in this deck with Mind Shatter that says target player discards X cards at random. So we can take away a few crucial cards or even their entire hand. And then Erebos' Intervention says choose 1, target creature gets -X until end of turn, you gain X life or exile up to twice X target cards from graveyards. So this is a flexible spell that can help us out in a lot of situations. Speaking of a flexible card, we've got Profane Command, which says choose 2. Target player loses X life, return target creature card with converted mana cost X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Target creature gets -X until end of turn, or up to X target creatures gain fear until end of turn. So this can take out a player, get us something back, take out a creature, or help our creatures get through. Next up, there's Curse of the Swine, which gives our opponents a bunch of pigs, and that's always a good thing. It says exile X target creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller puts a 2/2 green pig creature token onto the battlefield. Fine, it's boar, not pig. Yes, I'm disappointed. Anyways, next up there's Return to Nature, which is a very flexible card. It says choose 1, destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or exile target card from a graveyard. And finally, we're running Wilt, which says destroy target artifact or enchantment, and it's got cycling for 2. Now, all of our X spells create Hydras, but we've actually got some Hydras in this deck too. So now let's move on to tactic number 4, Exotic. First up, there's Hungering Hydra, which enters the battlefield with X++1 counters on it, and it can't be blocked by more than one creature, and whenever it's dealt damage, we put that many ++1 counters on it. So this Hydra can grow and grow and grow through more combat. Now, each of these Hydras have that exact same thing. They enter the battlefield with X++1 counters on them, so I'm just going to say that once. So when Vastwood Hydra dies, you may distribute a number of ++1 counters equal to the number of ++1 counters on Vastwood Hydra among any number of creatures you control. And then there's Feral Hydra, which we can pay 3 to add a counter to it. And actually, any player can do that if they want to help for whatever reason. And then there's Genesis Hydra, which says whenever you cast a spell, reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put a non-land permanent card with converted mana cost X or less among them onto the battlefield, then shuffle the rest into your library. So this is kind of like a Genesis Wave Hydra, but just for one thing. And it's also a Plant Hydra, which is pretty cool. Even cooler, though, is a Goat Hydra with Capricopian. It has pay 2, put a ++1 counter on Capricopian, then you may reselect which player Capricopian is attacking. Only the player Capricopian is attacking may activate this ability, and only during the declare attacker's step. So basically, someone can pay 2 to have it attack someone else, but it makes it bigger, and then that player can pay 2 to attack someone else, and it makes it bigger. And finally, there's Nimbus Swimmer, which is a Leviathan and not a Hydra, though it's pretty much just a flying Hydra. Yep. But now let's talk about some X spells that can really throw a wrench into our opponent's plans. So it's time for us to move on to tactic number 5, Exclude. First up, there's Syncopate, which says counter target spell unless its controller pays X. If that spell is countered this way, exile instead of putting it into their graveyard. And then Condescend says counter target spell unless its controller pays X, scry 2. And then Power Sync is an older card, so I'm going to read its Oracle text. Its Oracle text reads, counter target spell unless its controller pays X. If that player doesn't, they tap all lands with mana abilities they control and lose all unspent mana. Next up, there's Logic Knot, which says counter target spell unless its controller pays X, and on top of that, it's got Delve, so we can utilize our graveyard to get that X higher. And then Thassa's Intervention says choose 1, look at the top X cards of your library, put up to 2 of them into your hand and the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order, or counter target spell unless its controller pays twice X. Finally, although it's not an X spell, Inspiring Call is a fantastic piece of board wipe protection. It says draw a card for each creature you control with a ++1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. So this can save our army of Hydras and draw us a ton of cards. But we've got plenty of other ways to draw cards, so let's talk about them now in tactic number 6, Examine. First up, there's Read the Runes, which says draw X cards for each card drawn this way, discard a card unless you sacrifice a permanent. And then Breakthrough says draw 4 cards, then choose X cards in your hand and discard the rest. And then Epiphany of the Drownyard says reveal the top X+1 cards of your library and separate them into 2 piles. An opponent chooses one of those piles, we put that pile into our hand and the other into our graveyard. So this is kind of like a reverse Fact or Fiction X spell. And then there's Mindspring, which very simply says draw X cards. Gadwick the Wizened does the exact same thing when it enters the battlefield, but it also has whenever you cast a blue spell, tap target non-land permanent opponent controls. So he can help us draw cards and get our creatures through. Next up, there's Damnable Pact, which is a pretty flexible spell. It says target player draws X cards and loses X life. So this can help us draw cards at the cost of life, or it can help us take out opponent if they're low. And then Wildest Dreams is a great way to get some cards back from our graveyard. It says return X target cards from your graveyard to your hand, exile Wildest Dreams. Next up, we've got an enchantment that can help us out though with Colossal Majesty. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. And that's a very easy requirement for this deck to meet. Next up, there's Elemental Bond, which says whenever a creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. And Garrick's Uprising is very similar. It says, when it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Creatures you control have trample, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So this card does a lot for us. It draws a card for us right away. We're going to be drawing cards off of that 4 creature power trigger, and then also gives all of our creatures trample. So this is a draw engine for this deck, and it helps us get our Hydras through. And finally, there's Kiora, who starts off at 7 loyalty, and she has, whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card, and her -1 is untap target permanent. So she can draw us cards, and we can utilize her to untap our commander for extra mana. And speaking of extra, let's move on to tactic number 7, extra. First up, there's Winding Constrictor, which says if 1 or more counters will be placed on an artifact or creature you control, that many of those counters +1 are placed on that permanent instead. So essentially, each of our Hydras come into play with an extra +1/+1 counter on them. And Corpse Jack Menace does this in an even bigger way. It says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters will be put on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. So this essentially doubles up the size of our Hydras when they're coming in. Again, this deck is looking to hit with some big creatures, and these can come in really handy. But we've got some other ways to help out too in tactic number 8, extreme. First up, there's Gelatinous Genesis, which says put XXX green ooze creature tokens onto the battlefield. So this can make us a ton of ooze creature tokens, and on top of that, we get a Hydra too. Next up, there's Biomass Mutation, which is a fantastic combat trick for this deck. It says creatures you control have base power toughness XX until end of turn. So this is basically an instant speed pump spell that takes advantage of our Hydras having counters on them. A somewhat similar card to this is Tribal Unity, which says creatures of the type of your choice get +X/+X until end of turn. If our opponents don't block some Hydras, we can get a ton of damage through, and even if they do, we're going to be taking out their creatures with ease. But a big way to get a lot of damage through is Overwhelming Stampede. It says until end of turn, creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So the biggest Hydra on our field pumps all of our Hydras, and then they all get trample, and we smash them face. And finally, there's Dragon Throne of Tarkir, which is essentially a repeatable Overwhelming Stampede on an equipment. But on top of these, we've got other ways to get our creatures through. So now let's move on to tactic number 9, Exceed. First up, there's Icy Blast, which says tap X target creatures, and it's got Ferocious. If you control a creature with power 4 or greater, those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap steps. With this deck, we're pretty much guaranteed to have a creature at 4 power, so have fun not untapping your creatures. And then Open-Ended Wonder says, X target creatures can't be blocked this turn. Until end of turn, those creatures gain. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So this can help us get our army through, on top of drawing us a ton of cards. Finally, there's Bellowing Tangleworm, which has Intimidate, and says other green creatures you control have Intimidate. So now all of our Hydras can't be blocked except by artifact creatures and or creatures that share a color with it. Now, smashing our opponents with our own creatures is fun, but smashing them with their own creatures can be even more fun. So now let's move on to our final tactic, tactic number 10, Exploit. First up, there's Entrancing Melody, which says gain control of target creature with converted mana cost X. And then Dominate is similar, but it's an instant and says gain control of target creature with converted mana cost X or less. Next up, there's Mass Manipulation, which says gain control of X target creatures and or planeswalkers. So this can help us gain control of some of the most powerful creatures and or planeswalkers on the board. But as powerful as these cards can be, in my opinion, there's one that stands above them. And that would be the Golden Pig, which is our #1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Villainous Wealth. It's a sorcery for X, black, green, blue, and it says target opponent exiles the top X cards of their library. You may cast any number of spells with converted mana cost X or less among them without paying their mana cost. This spell is hilarious and fun for everyone. Well, except for the player that you're stealing all the things from. So choose a friend, or an enemy, that happens to have the most powerful cards at the table, and just start getting cards off the top of their library and casting them for free. This can put you way ahead of your opponents, and then you can smack them with your own things, and everyone has fun. If you've never cast a Villainous Wealth for a ton of mana, I highly recommend it. And remember that when you cast Villainous Wealth in this deck, you not only get all those cards, but you also get a Hydra. So even better. Anyways, a huge thanks to Jameson for supporting this channel. I had an absolute blast building this deck. But now that we've gone through all the cards, let's see how our deck compares in cost, so it's time for us to move on to the price breakdown. The average Zaxara EDH Rec deck is going to set you back $401.35. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at $39.01. But with all that money that we're saving, let's take a look at some reasonable upgrades to consider. First up, let's add in Pull from Tomorrow by taking out Damnable Pact. Next up, let's add in Herald of Secret Streams by taking out Bellowing Tangleworm. And then let's add in Finale of Revelation by taking out Breakthrough. Next up, let's add in Steelbane Hydra by taking out Wilt. And then let's add in Stroke of Genius by taking out Read the Runes. Finally, let's add in Unbound Flourishing by taking out Mind Shatter. And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this deck tech are. Do you like the direction that I took it, or would you take it a completely different one? So yeah, let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks again, and have a good one.